Let's turn our attention to John chapter 21. I really thought it good that Wayne did that kind of elongated study of the book of 1 John with us right before he left. Because there were some things in there that I haven't thought about, at least for a long time, and some things that were impressed upon me that I believe I need some improvement on. And I thought about a thing that happened here that is written about in John chapter 21. I did not bring it up in class because I wanted to develop the idea a little bit more, and I wanted to talk about it in a sermon. And really, this is a continuation of our Bible classes that we have had for the last few months with Wayne in 1 John. So think with me here. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. He manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together, and Simon said to them, "I'm gone fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" And they answered him, "No." He said, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a fish, or you will find a catch." And so they cast, and they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came into the little boat, and they were not far away from land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And so when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said this the third time. "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper, and said, "Lord, who is the one?" Lord, who is the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain till I come, what is that to you? Follow me." Therefore this saying went out among the brethren, that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who is testifying these things and wrote these things. We know that his testimony is true. There were also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that could be written. Jesus here manifests himself, and probably from John's perspective and John's writing of the gospel, this may have been the last time that Jesus manifested himself to the apostles before he was taken up into heaven. We don't know the exact order that all of these things are told, because the Jews did not tell stories in chronological order. They told them in order of importance. And so some of these things are not listed in chronological order. And trying to put them that way is really a futile effort. But Peter and the rest of the apostles at this time seem to have given up on the cause. Jesus is dead. He's gone. We don't know what's going to happen. They're out there all gathered together. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. What's he doing? He's going back to his old job before Jesus called him to be an apostle. And the rest of them say, well, we'll go with you. We don't know what else to do, so we'll go fishing too. And you remember when Jesus called them, they were fishing. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 17, Jesus told them that they needed to come and they needed to follow Him. Let me get to verse 17 here. As he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, follow me, I will make you fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed Him. And so Jesus has called them to a higher form of fishing, but at this point in time, they don't know what's going on. They don't know what to do. And so they revert back to their old ways. Now, for these men to have gone out after all of this and proclaimed the gospel to the world, it shows the depth of faith that they had and the fact that they had seen the risen Lord, because after He died, it seems they did not believe He would be risen from the dead. They didn't understand those prophecies. And they were going back to their old life because, here was Jesus come to put His kingdom into place, to bring it to the world, and now they've killed Him. Cause is over. It's done. For somebody like that now to turn around and begin preaching the gospel shows that they saw something that made them believers. They would have had to seen the risen Lord to do that. This isn't some men who conspired to steal His body out of the tomb, as some have charged today. And that's a foolish charge, because the Roman guards were well trained. They would have called for reinforcements if they had tried to do that. They couldn't have stolen His body out of the tomb. But, there's those that have this conspiracy theory. These were not men that would have conspired to do that. In Mark 16, at the beginning of the chapter, when Mary and the women come to the tomb and they see the tomb is opened, and they go back and they tell the other apostles don't believe them. Oh, you're just dreaming dreams. You're nuts. You're crazy. It couldn't have happened. Until they saw Jesus for themselves. We oftentimes give Thomas a bad rap for being doubting Thomas. In fact, all of the apostles were doubters until they had actually seen the risen Lord. And He said to all of them the same thing He said to Thomas. He showed him His hands, His feet, and He said, come here and feel the wounds. It's me. It really is me that is risen from the dead. And they all had to go through that. Thomas just didn't happen to be there that first time when Jesus appeared to the rest and made them believers. For whatever reason that was, and I don't know, so I'm not going to speculate on it. But, and that just shows their depth of conviction, that going from that to becoming those who proclaim the gospel to the world, it had to be something that brought them around. And now day is breaking as we continue looking at our text in John chapter 21. And they've been out fishing all night, fruitlessly, and they're ready. They're probably about ready to come back in, and they're coming back in towards shore, and they see a man on shore. They don't know who it is, and the man calls out to him, says, "You don't have any fish, do you?" How would he know that? Had to be something special about this guy. And he says, throw your net on the other side of the boat there, on the right side of the boat. And they do, and immediately the net is just filled with fish to the point where they can't even pull it back in the boat. Now, normally a net that's that full of fish would break, but this one didn't. And so that was another miracle that was being performed. And of course, they immediately, at least John, the Apostle John, immediately recognizes that this is the Lord. And he says this to Peter. Now, this brings up a question. When God tells us to do something, do we do it? Or do we start making excuses? A lot of times, there's an old saying that when you keep on doing, the definition of insanity is when you keep on doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. And here these men had been out all night in the boat, casting the net, probably out both sides of the boat. I wouldn't think they would have only cast on the left side of the boat. But Jesus picked a side of the boat, says, cast your net out on the right side, and they did. Immediately, when God tells us to do something, do we have the faith in Him to follow through? A lot of brethren, for example, and I'm just going to throw out one quick example, and then we're going to move on. Not the main point of the lesson. But I've heard brethren say, withdrawing fellowship from an unworthy or from a disorderly brother doesn't work. Well, wait a minute. Maybe it didn't work in this case the way we wanted it to work. But did it work for the purpose that God told us to do it? Sometimes we're looking for something different than the purpose God has in mind for the things He has told us to do. We need to understand that when God tells us to do something, we need to do it. Whether we've tried it before and it didn't work the way we thought it should or not, we need to do it again. Because God told us to do it. In Romans chapter 8, and we read from Romans chapter 8 earlier, verse 28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. For those He foreknew, He also predestined to become conformed to the image of His Son, so that He would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom He predestined, He also called, and these whom He called, He also justified. Those whom He justified, He also glorified. When God tells us to do something, sometimes His purpose for telling us to do it is different than what we think it ought to be. And we need to learn to trust in God enough that everything God tells us to do is going to work out for His glory and His honor. Not necessarily ours. People have said, every bad thing that happens to you, there's a reason for it, and it's going to work out for your benefit. No, that's not what the Scripture says. It says it's going to work out for the benefit that God has in mind. That God has in mind. When Peter perceives it's the Lord in verse 7, he wants to get to him faster. He leaves the other men to drag the net into the shore, and he puts on his outer coat, and he dives into the ocean, and he starts swimming because he's got to get to the Lord first. Shows a certain impetuosity in Peter's character. And it also shows that he probably had a bit of a problem with self-pride. Peter, it seems, in several cases, wants to take the preeminence among the apostles. He doesn't ask to, be one that sits on the right hand or the left hand of Christ. That's left to two others. But nonetheless, Peter seems to want to have a position of preeminence. And Jesus, in Matthew 14, when Jesus is walking to them on the water, Peter, he calls out, "Lord, if that's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come." And so Peter jumps out of the boat and he starts walking across the water. And then he looks and he sees the storm behind him. He has Lot's wife's problem. He looks back, we might say. And he starts getting afraid. And what happens to him? He begins to sink. And so now the Lord steps over to him and grabs him by the hand and pulls him back up. and upbraids him for his lack of faith. Why would Peter ask the Lord to call him to come out to him on the water? If Peter was not trying to, we might say, show off that he had a little more faith than the rest of the apostles did that were in that boat. In Matthew 26, verses 30 through 35, Peter makes a very bold confession of faith. He says, Jesus said, all of you are going to deny me. All of you are going to flee when I am taken by the Jews. And Peter says, Lord, even if I die for you, I won't deny you. And you know, a little bit later when they're in the garden, and the Jews come, and they've got swords and staves. Well, Peter's got a sword, and Peter cuts off the ear of the Malchus, the servant of the high priest. As long as Jesus is there, Peter has a lot of boldness. As long as the other apostles are there, he's got a lot of boldness in him to try to protect the Lord. But as soon as he's by himself, and he's warming himself by the fire in the courtyard. And there's indication the Apostle John was also in the courtyard, and it was John, the apostle, that let Peter in, by the way. Peter's there all by himself, nobody to impress. Now he denies the Lord. Because he doesn't really have it in, he doesn't really have the faith in him that he needs to have to save. And so it appears that Peter has a problem with wanting to be the preeminent apostle. And of course the Catholic Church, it seems, grabbed onto this idea and they turned Peter into the preeminent apostle. Although if you look at the history books, if you really study true history, Constantine was the first pope of the Catholic Church. Constantine declared himself the head of the church. And he was the first pope. It doesn't go back to Peter. You can't trace it back beyond Constantine. But let's get back to our story. Now the net is full of fish, and it does not break. And they drag it in to the shore. And what has Jesus already done for them? Well, he's got a fire built, and he's got breakfast on it to serve them. Now, would you think the master would be the one serving breakfast to his disciples? Look at Mark chapter 10 with me in verse 35, beginning. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said, what do you want me to do for you? They said, grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? And they said to him, we're able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink. You shall be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized. But to sit on my right or my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those to whom it has been prepared. Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not to be this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Peter and John, or James and John rather, the two sons of Zebedee, didn't understand when Jesus was glorified it would be on the cross. And if they were on his right and on his left, that means they would have been crucified with him. But no, God reserved that honor for two thieves. One of whom Jesus said, today you shall be with me in paradise. No, James and John had a different purpose for being called by Jesus. And they were to serve that purpose out. And the reason was to be servants to their brethren. Are you noticing a thread? If you've been in the class on 1 John, are you noticing a thread here between the Gospel of John and 1 John? Serving the servants. is what he's talking about here. John's gospel tends to have that thrust of love in it, where the other gospels tend to be talking about the facts of Jesus' life a little bit more. Peter, now we go on in our text, and Jesus starts asking Peter these questions. Now, a lot has been made, and I think a lot of hot air and ink is wasted in talking about the two different words for love that are used here. Jesus used one word, Peter used the other word, but I think there's evidence really in the Scriptures that these words for love, these Greek words for love, were used pretty much interchangeably by people. And so making out something over, Jesus used this word, Peter used that, I don't think that has any point. The point of this thing is that Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Now remember, Peter is the one who threw himself into the water so he could get to his Lord faster than the other apostles. He didn't stay and help them drag the net in. He did not stay and serve his brethren. He had to get to the Lord. Jesus said, Peter, do you love me more than these? He's talking about the fish that they caught. Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, well then, love your brethren, Peter. Think about your brethren before you think about your own needs. That's the point that Jesus is making to Peter. We need to love our brethren. And we drove that point home pretty hard during the Bible lessons, but I think it needs to be brought home again. At the end of John the Apostle's life, it is said that he would always, every time he met with his brethren, he would say, little children, love one another. Little children, love one another. And he emphasized that point. And eventually his disciples asked him, John, why do you keep saying that? He said, it is the command of God. That's reason enough. John's focus of his life, it seems, little children, love one another. Now, in Galatians chapter 2, we read about the time that Paul says he had to withstand Peter to his face. And why was this? Because they were ministering to the Gentiles, and these Gentile Christians were out here, but then men from Judea came down, members of the church, Christians, and Peter withdrew himself from these Gentile Christians. Why? Well, he obviously wanted to show himself as being a holy man. But Paul had to withstand him to his face and said, Christ died for these brethren too, Peter. And you're not any better than they are. Why are you doing this? Peter seems to have had a problem with loving all of his brethren equally. And so Jesus here is trying to drive that point home to Peter, that if he loves God, he has to love his brethren. Because if you don't love your brethren whom you have seen, how in the world are you going to love God whom you've not seen? Can you see that point? Peter wants to get to God first. But that's not what Jesus wants him to do. Jesus wants Peter to love his brethren. Question was asked in the Bible class, can you love someone without liking them? Simple answer to that was, can you imagine the possibility of loving God without liking Him? I can't. If you don't like God, you can't possibly love Him. And if you're to love your brethren like you love God, you have to like them. Now, that doesn't mean that, I'll just give a little anecdote here. When I worked at Saddlebrook Resort, I was completely ruined for golf. I detest the game of golf because golfers are it's a game and they take it too seriously. I detest it. I don't want to be anywhere near a golf course if I can help it. And so some brethren love to play golf. Well, I'm not going to spend as much time with that brother as I would with a brother that likes to go hunting and fishing and shooting and things like that. Those are things I'm interested in. But that doesn't mean I don't like that brother who plays golf. It just means we don't have the same interests. And if that's what you're talking about when you say like, then yeah, I think that's possible. But the word like has a lot more to do with it than that. If you look at the dictionary definition, which we did in Bible class. If you have a brother in Christ who you just can't stand to be around, you can't possibly love that brother. And brethren, that means we support one another, whether we have the same interests or not. Many of you didn't know that I was speaking today. I don't know, some of you may not have been here if you'd known I was speaking today, because you don't like the way I preach. You don't like the things I have to say, or whatever it may be. But you know what? Loving your brother means you come and you support him, even if he is a little tedious to listen to. And I know I can be tedious to listen to sometimes. We support one another. We show our respect for one another when we love each other. And you know, this time, when we're between preachers, is a really good time for us to redouble our efforts. And when I point the finger out at you, remember I got 3 pointing back at Mark. I need this lesson too. Because I do believe that I have not been as loving to my brethren as I should be over my life. I need to do better. We all need to do better. And we need to grow in our love and our like for each other in this congregation. This is a good time to start. Excellent time to start. No better time to start than right now. We need to be hospitable to one another. We need to be sociable to one another. We need to be peaceful to one another. We need to not talk about our brethren behind their back, the things that they do. We need to work with our brethren. And if we disagree on matters of judgment, sometimes we just need to disagree on the judgment and move on. But that doesn't mean that we don't like that brother because we disagree with him on a matter of judgment. There was a congregation one time that was talking about cutting down a big old oak tree in their yard that some of them were kind of afraid of, and they felt like it might fall. And there was one brother who was adamantly opposed to cutting down that tree. I believe this happened in Georgia. Somewhere, I don't remember. Brother Bill Hall told the story. And on the Saturday that the men agreed they were going to cut down the tree, the first one there was this brother who had adamantly opposed it. He had his chainsaw in the back of his truck and he was ready to go. And he said, "What are you doing here? You didn't want to cut down this tree." He says, "Yeah, but we made a decision. And I'm a part of this group. And when we make a decision, I'm going to do my part, whether I agree with it or not. This is a matter of judgment. And I agreed to accept the judgment of everyone else that wanted this tree gone. So we're cutting it down. And I'm going to help." That's the kind of attitude we need to have with our brethren that we disagree with. In 1 John chapter 4, and reading verse 20, "If someone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen." If you don't love your brethren, if you don't respect your brethren, if you don't like your brethren, you're a liar when you say you love, like, and respect God. You can't do the one without doing both. You must do both. In Matthew chapter 22, when Jesus is reciting or answering the question, which is the greatest commandment, Matthew chapter 22, begin reading with verse 34. "When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" The entire Bible, this entire book can be summed up. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And you will love your brethren. That's the whole law. Some people want to separate love and law. You can't separate them. And if you say, I love God and I believe in the Bible, and you hate your brother, you're a liar. You can't go to heaven, and you can't serve God faithfully. That's really the point I wanted to drive home this morning. And I think we all need it, and we all need to do better on that. And I hope that you've gotten something out of this lesson. If there's anyone this morning who is subject to the gospel invitation, we now would invite you to come while we stand and sing.